Now, Russia has launched a major aerial assault on Ukraine just days after the United States shut off military aid and also paused intelligence sharing. President Volodymyr Zelensky has said that the Ukraine-UK talks are about just and lasting peace and hopes for some constructive dialogue with the United States in Saudi next week. And our next report tells you as to how Russia is intensifying the scale of the attack as Donald Trump is pushing for a peace deal but cutting off the supply of weapons to Ukraine.
Russia has unleashed a massive bombing campaign across Ukraine in the wave of attacks that targeted energy facilities struck residential complexes. Russia is pushing Ukraine to breaking point. Ukraine claims multiple Russian strikes have killed at least 20 people and injured dozens, while a Russian assault hit the center of Dobropilya in Ukraine's eastern Donetsk region. A drone attack struck Kharkiv region. On the front lines, Russian forces have almost surrounded thousands of Ukrainian troops who entered Russia's Kursk region last August. Amid a pause in US military and intelligence assistance, Ukraine has been hoping to use its presence in Kursk as leverage over Moscow in its peace talks. That prospect seems to be slipping away now. Ukraine's outnumbered and outgunned troops feel US President Donald Trump is towing the Russian line, putting lives of thousands of soldiers at risk.
If Russia continues here, it is a signal to all dictators in the world. All these people are watching. China is watching. North Korea is watching. Iran. All these things. These places are watching to see how we will react. Our ability as people to forget if it doesn't directly affect us works in favor of dictators because they are able to do things like mass murder, rape, mass graves, genocide, kidnapping, all of these things.
The relentless aerial assaults come days after Trump threatened new sanctions and tariffs on Russia, even as he backed Moscow on sealing a peace deal.
I'm finding it more difficult, frankly, to deal with Ukraine. And they don't have the cards. They don't have the cards. As you know, we're meeting in Saudi Arabia on sometime next week, early. And we're talking, I find that in terms of getting a final settlement, it may be easier dealing with Russia, which is surprising because they have all the cards.
President Zelensky is, however, refusing to budge. He calls for more sanctions against Russian bombardment, with tensions escalating between the US and its NATO allies. Disagreements over Europe's stance on the Ukraine war. Reports suggest Trump is considering withdrawing American troops from Germany and redeploy its forces in Hungary. With senior US and Ukrainian officials meeting in Riyadh next week to discuss the first steps of Ukraine peace deal after the Oval Office blow-up between Zelensky and Trump. Can Kyiv secure the security guarantees that it seeks on ending this war?
All right, now to give us more perspective in terms of what is happening at this moment in terms of the war in Ukraine, we are joined by Mr. James Jackson, who's a defense journalist and also a political analyst. He's joining us live in this broadcast. Mr. Jackson, just a couple of hours back, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has put out a tweet saying that there are realistic proposals that are on the table. When he travels to Riyadh, there is a possibility that he could, of course, get closer towards some kind of a deal. Do you think at this moment, considering what is happening on the battleground and also in terms of how the Ukrainian president has climbed down from the time that he had that meeting with Donald Trump at the Oval Office, the Ukrainian president is more willing to do some kind of a deal here?
I think, this is almost a chess game, and rather than just being between Ukraine and Russia, there are now three players, at least, with the US seeming to take a increasingly hostile tone against Ukraine. You heard President Donald Trump there saying that he finds the Ukrainians harder to deal with. Now, the US is responsible for about half of the military aid, or over half of the military aid for Ukraine, Europe covering up most of the rest. So this is all a chess game. And what matters is also in large part the perception of Mr. Trump. So, many analysts and European leaders as well saw the meeting in the White House, said, well, he stood up to Zelensky stood up to Vance and Trump, who were trying to bully him. But he clearly had to climb down and was called on to do so by NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, because they realized strategically it's not about who's right, it's about who's making the decisions. And that appears to be Trump, Vance, Vice President, and potentially even Elon Musk, who has also recently cut access to Starlink for Ukrainian forces, which has reportedly made their drones 15% less accurate. US intelligence sharing has been cut. So, the US is trying to push them into a deal, but I don't think Ukrainians or Zelensky particularly want a deal that involves Russia maintaining control over a large proportion of their land, 15%. So will they really go into a deal and give up this land? I think it's unlikely, but they have to look like they're ready to talk. And, reaching out to other partners like Ramaphosa in South Africa allows them to look like they're ready to deal, while actually the question of whether they are willing to make a deal is one that only Zelensky's team know right now.
It's interesting that you also point about what the Americans are doing here, the decisions that are being made to cut off the military supplies, to cut off access to Starlink, and to also cut off access to satellite data, such as that of Maxar satellite that was being provided to Ukraine. But what is also interesting is what Donald Trump is saying here. When he was asked this question, that Russia has increased its attacks on Ukraine at a time when Ukraine is low. He says that Russia is doing what anyone would do in this position. Is there a perception that is now clearly visible that Donald Trump's position seems to be almost concurrent with that of the Russians, and Ukrainians feel completely left out?
It's very hard to see it any other way. When you see Donald Trump calling Zelensky, who was elected in a landslide election, bringing together historically divided east and west of Ukraine, he won in almost every region. Very popular leader who many think has risen to the task of being a wartime leader exceptionally well. That's the feeling in Europe, where I'm joining you from, of course. So you see Donald Trump praising Putin, and we wonder, has Putin actually had, there were all these claims that Trump was a Russian agent. I don't believe that. But I think Putin's done a very good job of manipulating Trump, of flattering him. And it seems like ultimately Trump wants to force Ukraine into peace. Of course, bringing peace is seen generally as a foreign policy achievement for a US president. And sometimes they do force an unjust peace. That was also the case for Bosnia in the late 90s. Now, actually, hidden files show that President Clinton back then forced a very unjust peace onto Bosnia, where the Serbian paramilitary-backed forces managed to keep control of part of the country. So maybe he's going for another Dayton agreement, and I think that's worrying for Europe, because Vladimir Putin will not stop there, just as it appears the Serbs have not stopped in Republika Srpska in Bosnia.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Mr. James Jackson, for joining us with that perspective there. For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.